Welcome to our second in the webinar series, the Shine webinar series. Welcome to all the schools that have joined us. We should have a few more joining us in the next few minutes. We're delighted this afternoon to have Professor Rory O'Connor with us this afternoon. Professor O'Connor is the Chair of Health Psychology, the Director of the Suicidal Research Laboratory, and also the Head of Mental Health and Wellbeing at the University of Glasgow. So we're delighted to have an expert in the field with us this afternoon. It's a wonderful opportunity for Shine and for all the Shine schools. Some of you may recognise Rory from having taken part in the BBC Disclosure series on the topic of suicide called the Lost Boys, that was aired on the BBC. And also winning the Media Mind Award for Best Podcast on the MQ Open Mind, How We Can Work Together to Prevent Suicide. So obviously a difficult topic, but this afternoon's presentation will be on suicide and self-harm in young people. So the presentation will go first, and then once the presentation has finished, you'll have an opportunity to type in questions to interact with Rory. Okay, so I'm now going to share the slides. So delighted to hand over to Rory.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody on this wet day. I've just been soaked to get here. So my plan is over the next 20 or so minutes, I'm going to talk about obviously suicide and self-harm in young people, but really in the context of some of the work that we've been doing and looking at in the Scottish context, but then helping crucially to understand these complex phenomena. And really sadly, in the UK and in Scotland in particular, as we'll see in a second, the suicide rates are on the increase. In Scotland, after a period of maybe 10 years where we witnessed year-on-year reductions in suicide. Last year, the most recent data for 2018, which were published last year, showed its increase, and what's particularly alarming is an increase amongst young people and young girls as well as young boys or young men. So the sort of broad introduction, and so the context is a real issue, and obviously with you working in schools will recognise that this is a priority area for Scottish government, and there's a lot of commitments in terms of mental health provision in young people in Scotland, and let's hope that drives things forward in terms of reducing the suicide rate, but also tackling the issue of self-harm, which is related to suicide, but also is a phenomenon, an index of distress in and of its own right. So that's me just with the background, and then I'll talk a bit about specific risk factors after I've said a bit more about the rates, and then I'll focus in on a model of suicide that I've developed, which we use to try and understand the complexity, and understand the factors associated with suicide and self-harm. And then the second last thing I'll do will be really focusing in on, so you can see here what's described here as from suicidal thoughts to suicidal attempts. And really that's trying to highlight this challenge that lots of young people, lots of people in general, but lots of young people experience suicidal thoughts. And thankfully most don't make the transition from thinking about suicide to attempting suicide or engaging in self-harm, and we need to better understand that process. If we can better understand it, we can better identify those who are most vulnerable, but crucially also, hopefully intervene and get them the help that they require. So as I said already, the suicide rates are on the increase in the UK and in Scotland, and this slide really illustrates, published a couple of years ago, was a profile of the suicide rates in Scotland over a period of a number of years. But really what I want to highlight, does the pointer work in terms of on the screen? I wonder. Yeah, it does. So what's really noteworthy though is that suicide, self-harm, any form of self-injurious behaviour is very rare before puberty. So as you illustrated here, the very low rates of suicide deaths in both boys and girls, very, very rare before, let's say in this slide here, before the age of 14. Well, that wasn't 14 probably. Not quite true, but before puberty. And what you then see, both for suicidal behaviour and for self-harm, and we start to see an increase in actual deaths by suicide as well. So as you can see then a marked increase, we can see then the age group 15 to 24, we really can start to see this increase. And indeed, the largest increase in self-harm and suicidal behavior at any stage in the lifespan is in that adolescent period. So if we're trying to look at identifying particular groups at risk, we're looking at post-puberty and early teens, and really you'll see some data in a second, from 14, 15, really we start to see this marked increase. Now, the self-harm, which is any form in the community and in schools context, that tends to be instances of self-cutting, but basically that tends to be more likely to be female compared to male, which is really interesting because then we look at the actual deaths by suicide in every age group, including young people. It's more boys or more young men will die by suicide than women. And indeed, if you look across the lifespan, and I look in Scotland, about 3/4 of all the suicides in Scotland are male. So in the context of death by suicide, it tends to be a male phenomenon. But if we look at non-fatal suicidal behavior and self-harm more generally, it tends to be more female to male. And that's partly to do with some methods that people use. So this next slide is really illustrating what we describe as the iceberg model of self-harm and suicide. And at the very top of the iceberg, we've got the tip of the iceberg, we've got the deaths by suicide. Again, if you look in the Scottish context, that's about 700 people sadly who lose their struggle to live each year. And then we've got individuals still above the watermark of the iceberg of people who present to clinical services with self-harm. And that's usually present via accident and emergency departments. And again, if we look at the data from across the UK, there certainly seems to be, not only has there been an increase in the reporting of self-harm, but we also know there's been an increase in presentations to clinical services for self-harm across the lifespan, but also amongst young people. And one of the concerns is that if we, as we've now seen in the last few years, an increase in self-harm presentations amongst young people, our fear is that will maybe basically be associated with an increase in suicide at a later date. And in part may explain why we started to see this increase already amongst young people in Scotland. Below the watermark, what's hidden, the hidden scale of self-harm, some data from schools coming up shortly, but basically there are tens of thousands of young people across the UK who are self-harming each year, and that they're not coming into contact with clinical services, that they're hidden. And some of the work we've done, we did some work a few years ago looking at surveying what's known as the Lifestyle and Wellbeing Survey, included schools in Scotland as well as Northern Ireland. And what we found, as you'll see shortly, is there's a marked instance of, or marked prevalence of self-harm. And most of those young people who were reporting self-harm were not getting the help that they required. And indeed, the data would suggest about a quarter of them actually sought help or received help, clinical help or hospital help. So huge scale, the hidden scale of self-harm. Now, one of the benefits of the greater fluency or the conversations around suicide and self-harm in recent decades, say, has led to a greater awareness. And that greater awareness has led more people to talking about self-harm. And our understanding of that has improved, and it's continued to improve day in and day out. So just some really stark statistics, though, in the context of the school, is these are data from Papyrus now from a couple of years ago now, but we can see that we're still losing 200 school kids are lost to suicide across the UK each year. So really, 200 devastated families and 200 wasted lives. And then again, there's work that in 2017, the Papyrus Commission looking at what are the key issues around self-harm and suicidal behaviour in the context of the school. And really important findings. First of all, we see that 1 in 10 students, according to the survey, had shared their thoughts of suicide at one stage or another. But crucially, though, what that highlights then, if young people in a school's context are disclosing suicidal thoughts, that gives us an opportunity, hopefully, to get them the help and support that they require. But there are many, many barriers and many, many challenges to working with vulnerable individuals in the school's context, and I know a lot of staff will feel the challenge of that. And indeed, almost half in this survey in 2017 said that they weren't trained in suicide prevention, and would actually feel anxious if a young person did disclose their suicidal thoughts or that they were self-harming. So I think it's a ripe area, really important and target for a school's context in terms of looking more broadly in respect of suicide prevention in Scotland, and indeed in the National Suicide Prevention Action Plan. And I'm the co-chair of the academic advisory group to the government in that respect, and we really are focusing in on young people to try and really tackle this important group of individuals who are vulnerable. In terms of actual data, this slide illustrates data collected in schools. Now, they're a few years old, these data now, but they were, as you can see, we've got the 4 countries of the United Kingdom, and then the Republic of we haven't Wales there, but the United Kingdom and Ireland. And what we can see on average, at the very least, in Northern Ireland was about basically 10% of young people who actually reported that they'd self-harm. These are primarily 15 and 16-year-olds. And if you just then note that in Scotland, with about 14% overall of the whole population, 14% of our young people had told us they had self-harmed at least once, and most of that self-harm was in the previous 12 months. But you can see this marked gender difference, as I've noted already, is that self-harm is much more common in girls and in boys at that age group. In this study, we also asked young people, tell us about your motives that underpin your self-harm. Why do you think you self-harm? Now, these are not risk factors per se, but illustrate really powerful communications that these young people give us. And when we often talk about young people not being as sort of emotionally fluent, this really contradicts that, because there's some amazingly powerful quotations here. So that one in the top right-hand corner there, the physical pain when asked, why in this case was to do with self-cutting. Physical pain rules out the emotional pain. That's one of the young people had said to us, or I felt that I wasn't good enough and I couldn't escape and whatever, didn't want to live anymore. So it's that complexity of seeing no other alternative. And in the bottom right one, to take the pain from my heart to my arm. So again, really powerful statements of how a young person feels and when they try and explain their self-harm or suicidal behavior. And it's also important to note there's no one single reason why people self-harm or indeed engage in suicidal behavior. And it uses an end product of a complex set of motives. And it often frustrates me that when we see media coverage saying that bullying, for example, has led to suicide. It might be part of the complex puzzle, but it's never the single reason. And indeed, it's often how the bullying impacts on an already vulnerable individual, which is key. And it's understanding that vulnerability, which will help us with intervening. And then we also asked them about what influenced their self-harm, their decision to self-harm. Again, these data are, I think, about 8 or 10 years old now, the quotations. So you can see in the top right, we talk about Bebo and MSN. Now, I dare say we ran that study again, we would see that be replaced obviously with Twitter or with Instagram or WhatsApp or Snapchat or whatever. But what this illustrates is often this, what we sometimes call the imitative or the modeling effects, and that actually knowing somebody else who's self-harm increases the likelihood of you self-harm. Knowing somebody else who's died by suicide increases your own risk. So that social transmission effect is really important to understand in the school's context, and obviously every school should have a suicide prevention, an active suicide prevention policy, and what a school should do after a death. If a death has happened, that there's a crisis response plan in place. Whole range of factors I'm going to give in a couple of slides time. I'm going to give, there's a figure which sort of illustrates the complexity of the factors associated with suicide and self-harm in young people and adolescents. But what this, I just want to focus on, as a study we did a couple of years ago looking at sleep problems and self-harm. And again, this is a bit of a busy slide, but what I want to just illustrate here is, I mean, it's unsurprising perhaps, the fundamental importance, this is with adolescents, about 10,000 adolescents in Norway, but we find the exact same pattern in Scotland, is it the strong relationship, these are association between sleep problems and self-harm, but it's what we describe as a dose response. So it's not simply that there is a relationship between self-harm and sleep problems, but rather is that you get this sort of slope relationship. So the more, if your sleep is even more disturbed, even more disrupted, and even more instances of insomnia, for example, that not only is it associated with self-harm, it's associated with the frequency of self-harm. So although adolescence is a period in which sleep is disrupted, we need to better understand that vulnerability, because anything which interrupts your sleep, which then will interrupt your sort of basic ability to problem solve, your basic ability to regulate your emotions, is associated with self-harm. And indeed, so this basic process of sleep, we really need to try and target that more. Looking a bit beyond the school context these are data from Scotland. We conducted a couple of years ago now the Scottish wellbeing study, and we were interviewed 3,500 young people. These are aged 18 to 34, this cohort, and we asked them a whole range of questions, and then confidentially asked them questions about their suicidal history. And what's really stark here are the high rates of suicide attempts and self-harm. So you can see here, if you look at all adults on the left-hand graph here, what we can see is 11% of the 18 to 34-year-olds living in Scotland have told us that they have attempted suicide at least once in the past, and that 16% have reported that they had self-harmed. So the self-harm data are pretty consistent with what we find with adolescents, young people, a much younger population. But this is the first study in the UK really to focus in on is 18 to 34-year-olds when they've left the school context. So lots of distress out there, really important we try and tackle it. So moving on then, I've alluded to the fact that there are many different risk factors for suicide and self-harm, and that they span a whole range of different domains. So this slide illustrates, this is a review paper we published a few years ago, which illustrated some of the key risk factors for self-harm. As you can see, I'm not going to go through them in detail here, but you can see some of the key factors. So early life trauma is a big one, and obviously a big focus for Scottish government. Parental mental health problems, divorce, any disruptive, anything which disrupts the sort of attachment relationships early in life is a vulnerability factor. But there are also things like poor problem solving. I'll come back to perfectionism shortly, but a whole range of factors there which are associated with increased risk of suicide and self-harm. So that's just a list of the factors. And what this next slide is really was our attempt to sort of bring this together in a way of understanding the complexity. And all I really want to focus in on here is that what we're all trying to do in the remainder of this for the last maybe 10 minutes I'll probably go on for, and we try and help us understand how those different ranges of risk factors increase the likelihood that a young person experiences a particular type of psychological distress, which is either suicidal in type. So because if you experience suicidal distress once, you're more likely to experience it again, or that the psychological distress is about relieving pain, and that sort of often is characterized as what we sometimes describe as self-harm or non-suicidal self-injury. The key message is complex set of factors which leads to the emergence of suicidal thoughts and self-harm. So over the last number of years, though, we've been trying to get inside, let's go back a second, inside this sort of black box of understanding the emergence of a particular type of psychological distress, which is suicidal in sort of characteristic. And what that led me to do was to develop a sort of psychological model of understanding suicidal behavior, the emergence of suicidal behavior across the lifespan, but it applies equally to young people. So again, the other thing worth saying is all the material I'm talking about today is available on our website. I have a lab website, the Suicidal Behavior Research Lab. On our website address is simply suicideresearch.info. So it's all one word, suicideresearch.info. There's more material about this IMV model, or the integrated motivational volitional model, and all of the other studies I'll talk about or have talked about already. But all I want to really draw your attention to today, because it's beyond the scope of a brief presentation to go into detail, is we're trying to understand the emergence of suicidal thinking. And we know that yet there are vulnerability factors like mental health problems, characteristics of like depression and anxiety, like things like early life trauma, disadvantage. These are all key risk factors. But to me, the most important bit is trying to understand how those factors impact on the way you think and feel. And so the argument is that people become suicidal if they're feeling basically trapped in a situation, this sense of entrapment, which is driven by feelings of defeat, humiliation, shame, and loss. They're the key drivers. And we know that adolescents are particularly uber sensitive to these social signals of defeat or rejection or loss. And we know that from work that Sarah Jane Blakemore, as a cognitive neuropsychologist in London, has done a lot of work on the sort of adolescent brain, for want of a better description. And we now know there's this critical period of hypersensitivity now in adolescence. And it means in a social context, you're much more likely to feel defeated and humiliated, and potentially then feel trapped. You feel trapped, you then become your increased likelihood or risk of becoming suicidal. So that's all I want to say about the key. So the key drivers of suicidal thinking are these key pathways: defeat and humiliation, experience at the same time as being trapped. You can't get away from these awful feelings. And then in a few minutes' time, I'll talk about this transition from suicidal thoughts to suicidal attempts, because we know that most people who experience suicidal thoughts never attempt suicide. So we need to understand that better. But before I go into the sort of that transition between thoughts and attempts, I want to focus in on a factor which we describe here as social perfectionism or socially prescribed perfectionism. And it's, and in very straightforward terms, it's a personality characteristic, which you think is developed earlier in life, but what it really assesses or taps into is the extent to which you're really concerned about what other people expect of you. And the formal definition here is trying to tap these excessive, often unrealistic expectations that we think others have of us. And that could be a family member, a friend, a boyfriend, girlfriend, a teacher, whoever it may be. But the point is, we're all somewhere on this scale of being socially perfectionistic and really, really sensitive then to these social things going on in our environment, especially if negative things happen to us. So for example, I'm very high in social perfectionism, so it's a vulnerability factor I have. We're all somewhere on this continuum. Now, we've done a lot of work looking at this characteristic, and thousands of young people we've assessed this. And what we've found a really consistent pattern is young people who are really high in social perfectionism are increased likelihood of self-harm and increased likelihood of suicidal thoughts and attempting suicide. So the question is why? And the answer to that why question came out of a study we did with adolescents in Scotland, actually. And what I describe here as the stress threshold lowering effect. And all that means, in essence, is if you have two young people, they're both experiencing negative life events or some stressors, if you're socially perfectionistic, you're much more likely to internalize that as self-criticism and be distressed by it, compared to the young person over here who is low in social perfectionism and is much less likely to be affected by it. So a very simple way I try and describe it as, it's like having a psychological thin skin versus a psychological thick skin, or this stress threshold lowering effect. Now, the concern in the study we did in adolescents in Scotland was that young people who had high levels of social perfectionism, even if they experienced low stress, they would increase risk of self-harm. That was concerning because it's very difficult to identify them as at risk, because ostensibly it looks as if everything's going okay in their life. So a really important factor of social perfectionism. I would direct you to, this is not just focused on young people, but this book by Will Storr, he looks at a whole range of things, but including looking at social perfectionism in the context of suicide and self-harm. And he specifically tries to explain male suicide on this left-hand one, this Mosaic Science of Life. That's an online free article. So I would really encourage you to read the left-hand article, maybe consider the book as well, because the book's a great read. Okay, so that's social perfectionism. And the reason social perfectionism I think is so problematic is, I think if you think back to my model, the IMV model, it kickstarts the process potentially to you feeling defeated and humiliated. It makes you much more likely to feel defeated and humiliated. If you're much more likely to be defeated or humiliated, you may be much more likely to feel trapped. You're trapped in that circumstance. And you can sort of see then how you might move down this pathway of suicide vulnerability or vulnerability to self-harm. Okay, so the last bit I want to talk about, then I'll open it up for comments and questions, is this transition thing I mentioned already. So lots of people, lots of young people have thoughts of suicide and self-harm, and thankfully they never cross that precipice. They never transition. And according to my model, what we describe is there's a whole group of factors. So if you think back to models on the right-hand side of the model, so this volitional phase going from suicidal thoughts or thoughts of self-harm to suicide attempts or actual self-harm. And the argument here, according to my model, is that there's these group of factors which I describe as volitional factors. There's 8 of them in this figure in the middle, and the presence of these factors makes it much more likely that if you're experiencing suicidal thoughts, you make that transition to actually engaging in suicidal behavior. So I'll just go through a couple of these for a second. And again, on our website, we've got a really good, well, I think it's a really good podcast in which I talk about the model in detail. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of things. So the message here, in some senses, is not rocket science. It's like it's saying that if you're experiencing suicidal thoughts and you're an impulsive individual, you're much more likely to be impulsive. Unsurprisingly, you're much more likely to then make that transition to attempt suicide. The greater extent to which you know people who have died by suicide or attempted suicide, much more likely for you to make that transition from thinking to attempting suicide. But a couple here which maybe might be more surprising are so the individuals who have high physical pain tolerance, and it's very difficult for you to, you won't be able to assess that in a school context, but we know we've growing evidence that physical pain tolerance, you have to actually have the physical pain tolerance to withstand the actual pain that is often required to make a suicide attempt. And we think that that's associated with this transition from thinking to attempting suicide. And similarly, fearlessness about dying, that you have to overcome the life instinct. And then the last couple are people who actually have a mental image of dying or death. Rather than just thinking about it, this actually is visualization, increase the likelihood to act on your thoughts of suicide. And then the very last one, sorry, is past behavior. So we know the single best predictor of any future behavior is past behavior. So if you've attempted suicide or self-harm in the past, you're statistically increased likelihood of doing it again. So the message from this slide is the presence of each of these volitional factors increases the likelihood that you actually act on your thoughts of suicide or self-harm. So I'm just going to finish on is a couple of slides looking at basically some data we've collected to basically support the premise I've just made, that there's a group of factors called volitional factors which are key in the transition from thoughts to attempts. So to do that, I'll just talk briefly about the study's wellbeing study, which I mentioned already, 3,500 individuals. And with that sample of older individuals, we were able to identify people who had never been suicidal, people who thought about suicide, and people then who'd attempted suicide. And again, what we're trying to understand is this transition. So what we did is people completed a whole range of measures, as you can see here. And if we ask ourselves the question statistically, okay, so what are the factors which differentiate people who think about suicide and those who attempt suicide? According to my model, it should be these factors, these volitional factors. It's nothing to do with these. So although defeat and entrapment contribute to becoming suicidal or in the first place, they're not key in that transition. And all you take in this slide is exactly as we predicted. If you look at just the people who thought about suicide and those who attempted suicide, there's no difference in each of these measures. But they're significantly more impulsive than those who attempted suicide. They have more capability to actually engage in the suicidal behavior. They have more mental imagery about death, and they're much more likely to know a friend who attempted suicide. And then we were surprised that there was no differences in these last two, but we think that might to do with your family. That might be to do with the fact that young people are obviously much more sensitive to the opinions and views of their peers than they are of family members. And I think that's maybe a sort of life transition thing. But the take-home message there is the importance of these volitional factors if you're trying to better identify who's more likely to make the transition from thinking to attempting suicide. It's also important to highlight, though, that our ability to predict in a clinically or meaningful or statistically meaningful way who will actually attempt suicide is really, really poor. And indeed, we're no better than the flipping of a coin at actually predicting who will die by suicide. And that's a stark reality. Okay, just a couple of slides just before I finish. What I've just said with regard to the sample of individuals aged 18 to 34 or 35, whatever it was, we find exactly the same when we look at self-harm in adolescents. That's just, you can read these papers as they are available if you want to know more. But the point is, the volitional factors are important for self-harm and suicide attempts. We've also found in a large cohort study, now this we only focus in on a few key factors, but this study here, really large-scale study led by colleagues in Bristol, that we see the powerful effect of knowing somebody else. We describe as the exposure to self-harm or suicidal behavior in others, a really key risk factor for actual attempted suicide or actual self-harm. Childhood trauma is also a huge issue, and indeed this is a different study. What I want to highlight here is people who attempt suicide are being really significantly more likely to experience some form of childhood trauma, and that slide just illustrates, it doesn't matter which type of trauma, people with attempted suicide are much more likely to report high levels. And I did a nice quote here, a really powerful quote from somebody reflecting on a colleague, Thiago Sortia, did this qualitative study. You can just see how you can read this in your own time. But the really powerful effects here of this quote relates your own experience of this person's experience of the parental abuse in some respects, how they then link that in their head to the sense of being trapped. And then that sense of being trapped, as we know, is linked to suicidal behaviors. A really powerful quote there. Okay, so just to bring it all to an end in a sort of whistle-stop overview, so what I'm maybe trying to highlight is we're looking at both suicide and self-harm. There are lots of different factors out there. But crucially, I think these are ultimately psychological phenomena, because an individual makes a decision to either self-harm or attempt suicide. And yet it might be affected by a whole range of factors, but we need to understand that psychology. And my model, the IMV model, it's really useful, I think, in trying to for us to understand that. And indeed, both in schools context and Scottish Government context, now we're looking at using my model as a framework to sort of tease out and guide what we would do to prevent suicide across the lifespan. Third one, obviously in particular to a school context, we need to think about what is a good, what are the characteristics of a good safer schools policy, and think about maybe how we all should think about how we can reduce this sense of entrapment, so that we empower our young people, because the more we disempower young people, the much more likely they are to feel trapped. And that sense of entrapment basically can become really pervasive and pernicious. And then the fourth one there is looking at interventions. Is it, and I know in the schools context it's maybe not necessarily particularly relevant, but we're just thinking about how we may intervene more broadly. We can develop interventions which reduce the likelihood that somebody becomes suicidal in the first place, which could be quite challenging because it might be these broader like disadvantage and inequality which is driving in part the suicidal thoughts, and it's very difficult for us at a sort of individual level to intervene. But so even if we can't stop the suicidal thoughts, we try as hard as we can to do so, but if we can't, then we can maybe try and stop the transition from thinking to attempting suicide, this volitional phase I touched on. And then the last bit is every single one of us has a role to play in suicide prevention, and it is everybody's responsibility. It doesn't matter how small or big our role, we all can play a piece in this sort of puzzle of tackling this really huge public health problem. And then lastly it's absolutely crucial, you working in the front line with vulnerable individuals, that you look after yourselves and each other, because only by looking after ourselves and each other can we obviously then support the vulnerable young people out there. Okay, so that will be for a second, that's me done. And so I'm just, we're opening it up now to comments or questions.
Okay, well, firstly, thank you ever so much. And it feels extremely cruel on my part to make you talk about that in such a short space of time, because that's a huge amount of information and lots of fantastic food for thought. So what I'm going to do now is to take the PowerPoint off and return us to the view of Rory and myself in the room. So hopefully you can all see that. I see we've got the chat bot coming up and a comment, and
let's just see the slides. Right.
Yeah.
Any questions then?
So do we have any questions that you would like to ask? I can maybe start with one. Just thinking about, a safer schools policy, is that something that you're working on with the government at the moment? Is there a sort of a template or a...
No, not at this stage. No, there's lots of different pieces of work going on at the Scottish Government level. And the bit I'm involved in, the suicide prevention, one of the actions for the suicide prevention action plan is focus on young people, and we're actually just at the stage of there's leads on that. I'm not one of the leads for young people specifically, but we're looking at what can we do, what should we do, but how does it map on to the broader mental health work that the government is doing to ensure we're not basically that we're not doing the same thing twice. But so I think there will be huge developments now to move forward in the next few few years, and indeed obviously like counsellors, funding for counsellors in schools. There's lots of training going on in schools, but ensuring that people that have access to those resources. Is that a question there?
Okay, yeah, it's very small, so I'm actually going to
I'll
stand
read,
up.
I can read it.
Can you read it? So, what resources can we access for young people relating to suicide prevention?
So there is Samaritans. I think it's on their website. Samaritans have a schools resource. I said schools resources, which I think are available. So I would go on their website. Actually, broadly, Health Scotland has, not specifically the schools, but a really brilliant resource about asking the difficult questions about exploring suicidality with somebody. And so, so you go to the Health Scotland website, the NHS Health Scotland website. There's a resource there about asking the question around suicide. I think it helps because I totally understand teachers in particular. I've spoken to a lot of teachers over the years, but it's really feel concerned about the questions that asking that difficult questions. So definite resource out there. Also, if you go to the National Suicide Research Foundation in Cork in Ireland, I think they also have guidance for schools in developing basically a whole school policy linked to suicide prevention. And then the last one resource would be in the United States. There is SAMHSA, which is a suicide resource center, and again, they have a lot of great resources for across the lifespan. Okay, that's the first question. Second, I'm interested in the concept of social perfectionism. How do we identify young people who are vulnerable to this, and are there specific strategies we can use to help them? Great question. It's tricky. So obviously there's a formal way when we do our research studies in which we assess social perfectionism using a standardized scale. Now, the important point is that even though social perfectionism in and of itself is not a problem, it's a problem when it's experienced with trauma or negative life events or all these other factors. So, but what I would maybe do is wouldn't try and go for a formal assessment of social perfectionism, but rather trying to get some sense in which an individual, a young person, feels really sensitive to these social signals, or really are overly concerned about what others think of them. And that's difficult to do in adolescence, and as a father of an adolescent, my daughter, I can see this obviously is really uber sensitivity to that, to social rejection. But I would just try and monitor feeling of social rejection. Another thing we know is this sort of this constrictive thinking and tunnel vision associated with suicidality, and that if you're a social perfectionist, arguably then you're much more likely then to feel, not catastrophize, but see that, oh my God, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to me. And this is where we look at bullying, both in social media context and more broadly speaking, is that social perfectionism is much more likely to be affected by that, much less likely then to see the future being more positive. We know that suicidal people, that thoughts about the future become really, really, really restricted. You can't see beyond the devastation or this catastrophic whatever interpersonal event. Okay.
I'm just going to go back up to the top.
Yeah.
I know we missed one at the top, which was how can schools and teachers better identify your volitional factors and use your model?
Well, so in you can use in different ways. So in a pastoral way, for example, if a pastoral teacher is working with a young person, it's just being aware that, first of all, recognize that the factors associated with the emergence of suicidal thinking are different from those that lead you to act on your thoughts. But if a young person discloses that they have been suicidal, I would then actually start asking the questions around, well, do they know somebody else as a close family member or friend died by suicide or attempted suicide? I would try and explore whether they've been actually imagining themselves in a visualization type way dying by suicide. Try and get some sense of how impulsive they are. Try and then basically, so you can, if you on that slide, which is with the model, there are questions. I've got one question beside each factor, and that can be a way in of asking those questions to try and assess the volitional factors.
Yeah, I think we were down to. So, what can we do to support this at a primary school level?
Really, it's tricky. But actually, there's just a new study about to come out, which showing that about 8 people in every 100. There's a study which is of young people who are age 9 and 10, and well, there's evidence that probably 8 or 9 of them in every 100 will actually have had suicidal thoughts. So yeah, that's obviously a small number on one level, but actually quite alarming on another, even at that young age. So as I say, you rarely see actual suicide attempts pre-puberty, but they still obviously happen, and very rarely. So the question is, so how do we support it? So I would maybe just the emotional literacy, helping people really talk about their emotions. So if there's somewhere, not with the evidence, if you look at the evidence for what works in a primary school context, to my knowledge, there's no direct evidence for it in terms of suicide prevention in a primary school context. But there is some work which suggests, obviously, these interventions or whatever supports which are facilitating problem solving, bolstering self-esteem and resilience. They're, a good place to start. So we're open, we have the conversation, and people think it's okay to talk about it. But also really empowering the staff. I think that's really less focus in one respect. Mental well-being, you can focus on the young people, but the thinking about suicide prevention specifically, I wouldn't do that with the young people, I'd do that with the teachers. Okay, so next is in the Panorama documentary. Okay, so that's the one I did, yeah. It raised the question of, can we talk too much about it and normalize suicide? Okay, yeah, I think I did say that. Yeah, so we have a very supportive mental health program in school, but now, how do we know if we're doing enough or talking too much? That's a brilliant question, and indeed this week, just with all the media coverage around Caroline Flack's death, it's a really important question, which is if we are saturating the media with suicide and with simplistic narratives around suicide, I think that is problematic. Now, there's no evidence yet whether it's good or bad, but I have a concern about it. And that's why it's really, really important that when we're talking about suicide more generally, there are media guidelines, there's reporting guidelines, both in social media and in the real world and the media, about how we should talk about these things. And so when we're talking about suicide, we're always promoting or highlighting the complexity. There's never just one factor, and that's really, really important. And we secondly, we highlight the fact that there are solutions out there. There are alternatives, are different. Because you think back to this tunnel vision, helping another vulnerable person to think about things do change, things do get better, and that suicide is not the solution. And then other things then around basically embedding it much more broadly in a sort of a wider mental health discussion of this is just mental health as part of our whole health. So you're not just focusing on suicide the whole time. Okay, but in a school, but there's guidance out there on how we should talk about suicide in school context. So I would look at those guidance which I mentioned at the start. Okay, what's next, and what would you see as best practice we could follow when helping young people avoid moving from thoughts to attempts? So I would try, so if we think that there are two different things probably in mind. One is what we try and do is dismantle the entrapment. So if you're a young person who's feeling just trapped, and it's just trying to help the young person, first of all, understand why they feel the way they do, and that the reaction often, it might be an exaggerated reaction, but the reaction is understandable. So you're legitimizing what they're feeling is real, and then in some way helping them problem solve so that the entrapment dissipates. If that's not possible, because there could be circumstances in which the young person just feels trapped, and it's very difficult to see how they can do something differently. And what I would do then to make sure you don't go to the volitional phase is one of the factors I didn't go into detail about was the sort of if-then planning. And that's basically, I would co-create, work with the young person in trying to keep themselves safe, to help them identify when their triggers or what triggers their thoughts of suicide, and then obviously to make sure that the access to the means of suicide is restricted. But again, I would do that with a mental health professional. I would encourage that with a mental health professional. Anything else?
I think that's to the end of that. That's brought us to the end of our questions. Just spoke too soon. So are you able to email the slides?
Yeah.
Yes, all of these slides will be available. I'll put them in your Shine secure folders, so you'll have access to them as long as Rory is happy with that.
Yeah.
So you'll have access to the slides.
And then just one there, just noted on the language issue. So on that question there, the bottom of it, making a really helpful point that you wouldn't have asked about knowing somebody else who died by suicide. That last question. But we try not to talk about committing suicide because it can be quite stigmatizing. It harks back to the days when suicide was a crime, and actually still a crime in some countries. So we try and talk about knowing somebody who died by suicide, took their own life, ended their life. So that's just one. That's sort of a bugbear of mine, and it's sometimes very difficult to get the language right. But we should. I try to get it right.
I think one of the things that stuck with me that you said on a program that you were on was about suicide being a permanent solution to temporary problems.
Yeah.
And I think that
nails
it
exactly.
perfectly.
I can't take credit for that. There's a famous suicide researcher, a guy called Edmund Schneidman in the United States, and he coined that term of suicide. That's the idea that suicide is this permanent solution to often temporary problems, and but that's the thing is that, especially a young person. So the reason it's risky in young people is this super sensitivity to social failure, and that leads to this sense of entrapment. And then also, the young person is much more likely to be impulsive and less likely to be able to see beyond. They see that these are temporary. Because remember, if you're in absolute distress and despair as a young person, 2 weeks ahead is like an eternity, and that's a big challenge. And that's why that statement is really useful to remind ourselves.
That's great. Okay, are we at the end of our questions? That was a really interesting discussion, fantastic presentation, and we are really delighted to have such an expert in our midst. So thank you very, very much for giving us your time this afternoon. So as I said, these slides will be available to our Shine members. And obviously this recording will ultimately go onto our website, so you'll be able to revisit. So just a couple of notices from me, just to wrap up before we go very quickly. Just to say to look out for your HPSC National Data Report that's coming through the post box very soon to all Shine schools, so I hope you've had that. Just a reminder of the conference. Shine conference dates will be on Wednesday the 20th of May, and we hope to see you all there at Glasgow Royal Concert Hall. The Eventbrite invitations will be going out soon. And also the mental health online survey, that observational phase is just about to start, and we hope to have the wider rollout in the summer term now. So that's the new timing. Okay. So thank you again to Rory, and I'm now going to stop the recording. So thank you and goodbye.